Hello and welcome to another instalment of History Hack. Alina, who's with us today?
We've got a returning guest with us today. We've got Louise Creechan, who has made it on the internet, ladies and gentlemen. She has made it on the internet.
Tell us how you've made it, Louise, since you were last on.
It's all down to you guys, so thank you so much. This is my Oscar acceptance speech right now. Thank you so much for having me on for the Charles Dickens Christmas episode.
Well, we are fulfilling our trash quota.
Exactly. Because someone somewhere called me trash.
Someone who protects all of their social media so no one can see it is quite happy to dish it out abuse to other people, is what we're saying.
Someone whose Twitter bio reads, "Not woke," told me off for referring to Charles Dickens as an entitled straight white man. Apparently that makes me trash.
He said it was out of context as well, but I'm sorry, we were discussing the fact that he built a wall down the middle of the bedroom so that his wife couldn't see him. If that's not the most entitled male thing I've ever heard in my life.
How's that out of context?
I mean, maybe he thinks that's okay. I mean, maybe he thinks, you know what? Dickens was onto something. I mean, the other thing we were talking about as well was that Dickens tried to put his wife in asylum hundreds of times to get rid of her. So again, if that's not something that I should comment with, that's entitlement, and I don't quite know what is.
It's hard. I mean, like, I'm possibly the most unwoke person alive, and even I was basically, and he didn't like your language either, I was basically fucking outraged at the idea of Charles Dickens and how he treated his wife as well. So I don't know.
I also enjoy it when you're like, oh, he didn't like your language, and then the next thing that came out of your mouth was fucking. So
yeah,
that's fine.
You know what makes you think? How does he treat his own wife?
It's a thinker. I mean,
yeah,
you know, Mrs. Anonymous commenter on the internet, are you okay? Can you blink twice if you're help?
Wave your hand if you need help.
Show us on the dolly.
We're here for you. We're here for you.
Anyway, he's had enough airtime. Fuck him.
Yes.
You are here because you are awesome and because you have got an awesome speciality, and you came on and did Dickens for us at Christmas, which was great because we wanted a sort of Christmassy themed one. But we invited you back to talk about what really turned you on, basically. And what turned you on is like learning difficulties in the Victorian period, isn't it? And dealing with illiteracy and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, that is my research interest. I'm not sure I would refer to it as it turning me on, because it's starting to get a little bit, I mean...
Well, would that be trashy? I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, you are talking to trash, so I should probably know what trash is, but yeah. I don't think I do. But yeah, no, my actual... I mean, as I said in Dickens episodes, I work on Dickens quite a lot, but my actual speciality is illiteracy and learning difficulty in the 19th century. So that might seem a little bit odd because we think of learning disability, particularly when thinking about conditions like dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD, these sorts of things, as being quite 21st century, well, 20th century, but, you know, mainly 21st century conditions, but they have a legacy in the 19th century, and that's really what interested me initially about the project that I did. So my thesis was on, I called it Unwriting Victorian Illiteracy, because I was trying to sort of break through the idea that illiteracy is just sort of a blank space, or just something that was about not having access to education, because actually there are a lot more complicated discourses going on, and people, authors like Dickens, like Gaskell and Hardy, maybe suggesting, although ironically, because it was in their novels, and obviously you need to be literate to read their novels, but suggesting that the contemporary push towards mass literacy might not have necessarily been a good thing. It might have been a site of exploitation. It might have been a site of a means of controlling the working classes. And yeah, so I'm trying to break down this assumption that becoming illiterate was always seen as being a good thing, as something that can help your social class, because that was definitely discourses that were happening in the 19th century, but we kind of forget about them because we think, you know, universal literacy equals progress, but does it though?
You said that, like, 21st century, we assume that, like, we've kind of invented the terms for it and everything. So what if I chuck, you've given us, like, a Victorian phrase, haven't you, that blows that away? So what is word blindness?
Word blindness is kind of our first thing that is similar to what we might call dyslexia. So we have to be careful when we're thinking about retrospective diagnosis, because we cannot use our same diagnostic categorization that we would today, because we can't examine the patients. So whenever you're working with historical medical conditions, it's always inferred. You can never say X definitely had this. Similarly with conditions like word blindness, same as when we think about hysteria and other sort of conditions, where we understand how the 19th century understood these conditions, but we can't necessarily put our label onto them. Yeah. So word blindness was a phenomenon that sort of gathered interest near the end of the 19th century. So it was first identified officially in medical writings in sort of the 1880s in Germany. Someone called Adolf Kussmaul, which, I mean, I did A-level German, but I'm kind of butchering the accent as well. I don't remember a word, to be honest. And
Was ist das, Louise? Was ist das?
Ich weiß nicht. I don't know. Ich habe keine Ahnung. That's it. But yeah, so that was the sort of thing. So they identified something that they kind of called dyslexia, or dyslexia in German. But it was the cases that people were originally looking at were cases of people who had been literate and often extremely educated, who had a stroke and were actually suffering from aphasia, which is a neurological change that can affect the ability to read, write, speak, these sorts of things. They'd have these sort of changes after a stroke. So it was quite confusing initially, the diagnosis of dyslexia, because it came out the same period where medical practitioners were thinking about aphasia and strokes. So they got a little bit confused. They kind of thought that for word blindness, so any condition where people were struggling to read, that a neurological change in the brain had to have happened. There had to have been some sort of event to prompt this. However, this was completely sort of blown out of the water when British physicians, starting with someone called Dr. Pringle Morgan, which I just think is the best name,
right.
When they started looking at children who obviously they hadn't gone through anything, they were too young, they thought. So they sort of came to the conclusion that actually their difficulties with learning to read and write must be congenital. So it was something that they were born with. So this happened in 1896. And so then they came up with the term congenital word blindness, which is probably the closest to what we would consider dyslexia. So Pringle, Dr. Pringle Morgan was sort of the guy that published on it first, but the guy that's the most prolific publisher on this was someone called Dr. James Hinchelwood, who worked at the Glasgow Western Infirmary and also at the Glasgow Eye Hospital, because a lot of people thought that it must be something to do with something going wrong with the eyes, because why can't you put your letters together? Maybe it's something to do with your eyes as opposed to something going on in the brain. So he was sort of really prolific and wrote a lot of studies. And sort of the big thing about these studies that is always commented on is the fact that with a lot of these children, that they were obviously very bright, and that their teachers would say things like, you know, if everything was done by oral instruction, actually this child would be the brightest in the class, but they just cannot learn their letters, they can't remember it, they can't put them together. So that the thing that's so distinct about it is the fact that there seems to be such a discrepancy between you know, the level of intelligence when you're talking to a child or when they're doing other activities, and the level of intelligence when they have to put things in writing or when they're trying to read. So that's how they kind of noted that they didn't just assume stupidity. They didn't just, well, they did assume stupidity, They didn't just assume severe intellectual disability, because obviously the child was in front of them and they were like, well, that's not right. This was when they were first getting diagnosed in the 1890s, though. So decades previously, the Earlswood Asylum for Idiots, which was sort of the Royal Asylum for Idiots, which I think was the
awesome title.
Oh, I know, it's just
Imagine
awful.
doing that now.
I know, and I actually think, from what I can remember, and I may be wrong, so I hold my hands up if I am wrong. I think Earlswood was where the Bowes-Lyon sisters, the nieces, cousins of the Queen, where they were housed and kind of put away. That came out relatively recently, but I think it was the same institution. But obviously, I'm talking about when it first came into being in the 1870s. Like the Queen isn't that old for her cousins to be in the 1870s. But the Earlswood Asylum for Idiots, which was first sort of functioning sort of 1850s, 60s. During the 1860s and to the 1880s, they had this massive influx of admissions of children into this idiot asylum. Obviously, when I'm saying idiot, I'm sort of using the 19th century cadences. Like, I am not calling intellectually disabled people idiots, because it is
we're just using it for the context. This is the period we're talking about.
Yeah, that this would be the catch-all title that 19th century people were using. But there was a massive influx of children getting admitted into the asylum, and the reasons given, so that in order to be admitted, they had to have a report usually from a family member, and these reports are just full of mothers or other family members saying that they're admitting them because they'd gone to school and they couldn't learn. They couldn't learn to read. They just couldn't learn their letters. So we've got this sort of history where, if we're thinking about the 1860s, 1880s, the Education Act that sort of mandated for universal education, elementary education, was 1870, but things were moving before then. So really, sort of most people were going to school before then. The 1870 Act just kind of mopped up a lot of the other areas, but most children were getting some sort of level of education prior to the 1870 Act. But basically, so if you're thinking 1860s, the thing that had changed that led to all these children getting basically put in asylums because they couldn't learn to read is because generations before, they would have just been sent to the fields. Like, they would never have had to become literate in the first place.
They just to it.
Yeah, exactly. So suddenly we've got this material change because education and universal literacy was being pressured, that because of that change in educational provision, swathes of the population were suddenly found themselves essentially disabled because they struggled to learn to read. So I think the history is really interesting there, although it didn't obviously have a formal name, and a lot of this is inferred that it was a learning difficulty like dyslexia. It's just interesting, and my work really deals with that idea of, why literacy? Because it's essentially a skill. Obviously, it's a very useful skill. I'm not doubting that. But what did that material change do that by the end of the 19th century, something that was quite normal suddenly warranted going to the doctor and marking you out as abnormal or even disabled? So that's where I sort of sit in terms of my research. Sorry, that was very long.
That's brilliant.
So Louise, you and I would have pretty much ended up in there, right?
Oh, totally. Yeah, I can't read. No, I can read because I'm dyslexic, dyspraxic, and I'm really, really trying for an ADHD diagnosis, and a whole host of other interesting sort of mental health diagnoses as well. So, just neurodivergent all the way. And I think you were chatting with me a wee while ago, Alina, you're dyslexic and dyspraxic as well.
Yeah, dyslexic, dyspraxic, dyscalculia, and your interesting suggestion to try the ADHD test has sparked something for me. So I might be going down that route too, because it would explain some of the things that I just can't explain about myself.
Yeah, there's obviously this isn't Victorian, but there are huge numbers of women who are getting diagnosed with ADHD sort of in their 30s, late 20s, because ADHD in women it manifests differently to boys, and obviously I'm sort of talking in quite gender essentialist terms. I don't mean that. I mean just the way that things sort of happen in primary school classrooms. Like very often, if you've got a male child or assigned male at birth child with ADHD in a classroom, they'll be very hyperactive. They'll be the ones, throwing chairs, screaming, that sort of thing. And so it's easier to say there's an issue there. Whereas women or people who are assigned female at birth are much more adept at masking any symptoms, so that they're less overt, and it might manifest in terms of concentration difficulties more than the hyperactivity. So there's a lot of women, and particularly women that have been diagnosed with things like depression in the past, that they actually are finding that, what is actually underdiagnosed ADHD. We just didn't have the vocab for it. There was actually a lot of people that didn't think that women could get ADHD. And similarly with autism diagnoses among women, again, because it's less overt, people didn't think that women could be autistic for a long time. So when we were at primary school, in the 90s, Elena, that would have been right in the middle of that. Well, they're not running around screaming, therefore there can't be an issue. So it's really interesting. People are trying to sort of correct that, but yeah, so ADHD obviously didn't have, not obviously, because it's not obvious. I really try and not say that, but I find that a tick, when it's your own research. And I really hate saying that because it's not obvious. It's obvious to me because I spent fucking years researching it. Sorry, I'm not supposed to be swearing on this podcast because I got told off about that too. But that wasn't a Victorian thing. That came a lot later. But I think some of these neurodivergent conditions, I think we were chatting about this before I came on, Elena, things like dyspraxia. They have these, so dyslexia was word blindness, and that was a 19th century thing. Much, much later, right into the 20th century, when dyspraxia sort of being manifested. So dyspraxia, which a lot of people don't necessarily know what it is the sort of coordination version of dyslexia. It also affects concentration, but it's mainly about coordination. But that was called clumsy child syndrome when it was first diagnosed.
To be fair, we are clumsy. Dyspraxic people are incredibly clumsy, so they're not kind of wrong. I mean, yeah.
Let's talk about cures. Victorians, how did they go? Did they have cures in inverted commas for dyslexia?
Nah.
No.
No.
It was just like that.
It was pretty much like, oh, that's interesting. What a shame. And then they would just kind of try and work through the letters a bit more. So there's not too much out there on trying to sort of combat it, because the reports that we have are kind of from case studies. So it's like, oh, I found this bizarre case of word blindness, and very often that would be the title, like an unusual case of word blindness, letter blindness without word blindness, which I don't quite understand the difference. And these sort of variations on a theme. So it's kind of like, oh, look at something interesting that I found, as opposed to, well, you know what? These are human beings. Let's maybe help them overcome their difficulties. Oh, no, we don't do that, because that would be, too helpful. So basically, you were just kind of forced to do more and more exercises, like in the classrooms, if your teacher would bother to teach you. That persisted well into the 20th century. I mean, even when I was at primary school, I spent a lot of time photocopying because I wasn't allowed to do the hard work, because I was on the dyslexic table at primary school, which I don't have a chip on my shoulder about whatsoever.
You would just never get away with it now, would you?
Oh, no, not at all. I remember, this is the deep childhood trauma, so I hope that after talking about my childhood trauma I don't get called trash again, because I don't think I can take it. But I joke about this in my stand-up, but at primary school I remember there was a table and the tables in the classroom were all like given names, like but it was obviously done by ability, although, you know, the teacher sort of wouldn't say that. And I was about 6 at this time, and there were the rabbits, and there were like the cheetahs and all this stuff, obviously the smart kids. I was on the clouds, as in head in the clouds, which all the other dyslexic kids were on, and it was really subtle.
God, you would never get away with that now. That's like abuse now.
Yeah. And I think about it, I'm just like, that wasn't very good, was it?
How is dyslexia portrayed in Victorian literature then? Because this is what you do, isn't it? You use literature as a sort of study mechanism for researching this stuff.
Yeah, so I kind of go backwards because I'm looking at 19th century literature. We don't have the same sort of diagnostic categories, because that doesn't come in, as I said, until like the 1890s, and even then it was odd. However, so I decided to look at illiteracy and the kind of politics of being illiterate or having low-level literacy in novels, and where that can be used as a means of resistance as opposed to the sort of model of deficit. So there's this kind of Victorian hangover that if you can't read, or if you have issues with reading or writing, that something's wrong with you, that's a deficit, that's a problem. Whereas there are numerous examples in Victorian literature where actually low-level literacy is a means of agency. So in examples that I look at, and you know, the fact that the authors are using this as a means of agency kind of suggests that there was an alternative kind of pushback against all these this supposed amelioration that on the improvement discourses about everyone becoming literate. So like in Hardy, there's loads of examples in pretty much every novel of a very traditionally educated character being pitted against someone that's from sort of a rural background that didn't have access to education. And it's always the character without the formal education that kind of trumps the educated character and shows them up. And it's often done through things like spelling mistakes. So I've got an article which I really, really need to send off. But the chapter in my book that will hopefully be done soon, maybe, where I look at spelling mistakes in Hardy and where they're used as these kind of like locations of resistance. So like a small example is in Far from the Madding Crowd, which I can't say, one of Hardy's early novels, there is this tiny detail. I love finding like a tiny detail. It's maybe in like 2 sentences of a novel, and then writing about, I don't know, 100 times that on analysing those 2 sentences, where there's a sort of rustic, there's these rustic characters always in the background of Hardy. There's kind of, they're used for kind of scene setting, but actually there's more to it than that, I think. And this rustic is called Henry, but he absolutely insists that you spell his name Henry with an extra E in it. Yeah. And there's this comment about how he would sort of tell schoolmasters that they were absolutely wrong. They tried to define him by spelling his name Henry. And the thing about that spelling error is that it comes into, it's no longer about it being right or wrong, but it's about identity politics. It's about having that strength to take ownership over spelling mistakes and different discourses, and essentially assert your own identity against that's being pushed onto you by the sort of by institutions, by the state, and these sorts of imperatives that are pushing towards mass literacy. In other things that I look at, there are examples in Dickens where the reading lesson is used as a site of exploitation. So very often sexual exploitation. There are so many examples in Victorian novels where these scenes of learning to read, where a sort of upper class guy will take pity on a poor illiterate working class girl and decide that he's going to teach her to read. And then by the end of the novel, they end up married. So obviously, but very often in their marriage, something else happens. Like in Our Mutual Friend, Lizzie Hexam, ends up married to Eugene Rayburn, but then he gets attacked by another suitor of hers and ends up permanently disabled. So, and she's then further excluded from society. So it's not like she's become literate in order to sort of fit in with her new husband's society. She's become literate, and then she has no use for that literacy. So that literacy was just used as a means of getting her to marry him. And there's a lot of this kind of these control elements in literacy lessons, sort of as they're portrayed in literature. There's a lot of abuse that happens in the reading lesson as sort of a space of control. So when I say I look at dyslexia, I use that as a jumping off point for sort of the politics of becoming literate, the politics of what it means to be portrayed as an illiterate character in a novel that, you know, a novel is a literate form, right? So there's a weird implicit politics there of how are you, novelist, using your literacy to portray illiteracy, and what are the social dynamics of that? So, I mean, I say this, and there are people that have tried to diagnose characters, particularly in Dickens, with various learning difficulties. So there is an example from Bleak House, in which a character called Crook, he is a character that famously spontaneously combusts in the novel, which is just hilarious that someone spontaneously combusts in Dickens. But so basically, because there's so much gin in his system, it means that he just randomly bursts into flames.
Probably going to see if there's any more lockdowns.
Yeah, pretty much. I think it's a real risk when they're deciding on what to do with lockdown, with people just kind of drinking themselves through the pandemic. I think that there should be sort of PSAs on the sort of quick PMQ questions and all that, and saying, you know, be careful, guys, because you might spontaneously combust if you have too much gin. Just look at this guy in Dickens. But yeah,
by the way, just so you know, she might spontaneously combust all the gin she drinks.
No, I've decided that that's okay. I've decided that if in this entire fucking mess, the only thing that happens is my liver takes a beating, I can live with that.
I mean, you could live with that until you burst into flames.
Yeah. At which point, it doesn't look like I'm going to get let out my house ever again anyway, so meh.
Yeah. I mean, at least it would be like quite a banterous way to go. Like, you know, I want to be remembered for something.
Sure, everyone would stop and read your headstone as well in the cemetery.
Exactly. It'd be like, here lies trash, she burst into flames.
Louise, I'm going to interrupt you because I want to know about autism in the Victorian period. I mean, did that exist? I mean, obviously it existed, but how did it look like?
Well, so autism is a little bit, again, like sort of dyslexia. It's hard to diagnose without the sort of same, just brain blank, without the same diagnostic criteria. And with something like dyslexia, which is why dyslexia was diagnosed like pre-dyspraxia, you've got like, it's the inability to learn to read or write that you can see in that period. Whereas autism, because it's kind of a social disability largely, those markers you might think that the sort of manifestation of things like meltdown, like sensory processing, like over processing, like difficulty sort of social relationships, that is far easier explained to the 19th century mind by something like just presuming madness, or presuming like something is wrong, but something nondescript is wrong with that. I mean, presuming child, but obviously people don't grow out of autism. So the autism generally manifests, if you see it in literature or if you see it in medical diagnoses, as just a sort of a weirdness, being off kilter. But it's a difficult question because ultimately we can't look at we can't look objectively with the same criteria and diagnose. But I mean, what I can tell you about autism is that because there were those connections with madness when it was beginning to get diagnosed in the sort of, sort of early mid, sort of like 20s, 30s, decades of the 20th century, they initially called it childhood schizophrenia. So there was that real link to mental illness, which obviously it is not. So it's, I think it's interesting because we consider these conditions as being neurodivergent. So neurodivergence, neurodiversity are sort of, neurodiversity is the movement to include all sort of neurological types within society and make sure that any outputs are easily accessible, not just for people that we call neurotypical, so those without conditions such as neurologically different conditions such as autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD, even a traumatic brain injury that causes some sort of difficulty or mental health issues. So the neurodiversity is the sort of societal attempt to include all of that. When we look at neurodivergent conditions, it's a connection that we make in 21st century society, saying there's something going on neurologically that affects processing and changes the way that you experience and view the world. Whereas, so in that sense, we group things like autism and dyslexia together under that movement. Whereas in the 19th century, or in early diagnoses like through the 20th century, the difference between word blindness, which is very much looking at the symptom, and then autism, which is childhood schizophrenia, that mental health context really comes into it with autism, whereas it doesn't in dyslexia. So I think it's quite interesting to just look at the way that our definitions change depending on how much we know about neurological difference and about how these things manifest.
It's weird. It's like, because there's that column that comes in on the census returns, isn't there, for lunatic? So there's like, on the end of the thing, it's like there's a numbers 1 to 4, and you have to tick the box if you have someone who is blind, deaf, dumb, or insane. And it's all lumped together at the end of the census return, where you declare if anyone in the house is any of the above, and that's about as much as they diagnose it.
Yeah, like lunacy has a much longer history than even the 19th century. Lunacy is a term that I think is probably early modern as well. They were using it, but I'm not an early modernist, so I don't necessarily know. But I know that sort of asylums for lunatics certainly started in the 18th century as opposed to the 19th. So there's a much longer legacy looking at that notion of madness. But of course, we don't know, but presumably a lot of these discourses on madness were actually people that we might diagnose with like a neurodivergent condition now.
So let's do a different word then that is from your period, which is idiocy. God, it's so harsh, isn't it? Let's talk about like baby idiots. How are babies with severe disabilities viewed at the time?
I mean, generally speaking, because you can't comment on every household, there was a turn that happened alongside the sort of poor laws, the Poor Act. So when it became the responsibility of the parish to sort of put people into workhouses as opposed to taking care for people within their communities. So that there's a shift in funding that happened with the new poor law that basically started the workhouses. So prior to the workhouses and the new poor law, the general thing that happened, unless they were disruptive or had any additional issues or family circumstances, if someone was deemed an idiot, while prior to sort of that funding shift, that they would very often be just cared for in the family home. They were part of society. They were seen as just kind of children, that they were harmless if that was the way that their disability manifested, and they were more commonly cared for in the home. However, with the change in the poor laws and with the change, and that was when asylums were really coming into their own as well. So just in terms, but obviously if you had to keep a person who wasn't necessarily working or that because they couldn't, that's a huge cost on the family. So that's when they started getting dumped into workhouses and dumped into asylums and specialist asylums for idiots. So, I mean, shame came into it for some of the sort of more wealthier families. But to be honest, like prior to those sort of changes in like the 1830s, they were part of society and they weren't necessarily shunned, particularly among the sort of working classes. That was fine. You would just, it wouldn't be as sort of shameful. However, you've always, since the sort of 18th century and the sort of lunacy, you've always got that aspect of you could always just dump them in an asylum. But it wasn't as prevalent until the sort of later 19th century to just kind of lock someone away. And that tended to be a financial thing. So if you couldn't afford to keep them, if you were poor, then that would be a way of sort of getting rid of them, putting them to workhouses. And then you've got your more kind of upper class families where it becomes a sense of shame. But it's interesting how shame is kind of class-based around matters of disability. Idiocy is a very broad brush term. It's not, it doesn't break it down into any more any categories. That could extend to something like Down syndrome, or it could also extend to something that's catatonic, that they wouldn't necessarily move or be kind of in ketosis for most of the time. Like there isn't any grey area with idiocy. It's just sort of one big category. I mean, one of the things that might be interesting to talk about just really briefly is about the origins of Down syndrome. I'm not sure if you know about. Okay, so Down syndrome, the term comes from John Langdon Down, who he has an awful article. This is kind of getting towards starting to think about eugenics, so it's not pleasant. But he has an awful article that's very famous about the ethnic classification of idiots. So what he does is he basically looks at all his idiots in his asylum. Again, 19th century term, his term, not mine. And he decides that amongst different types of idiots, you could classify them. And you could classify them according to how much they look or resemble like certain ethnicities. So the term for someone with Down syndrome initially was mongoloid.
Oh, yes,
and the reason,
right,
and the reason for that is because he determined that people in his asylum with Down syndrome looked like they were Mongolian. So they looked like they had large faces, or he thought that they resembled that racially. And then there was another case of some sort of encephalitis, and I can't remember, which is really, really bad, but where essentially if you've seen the pictures of like quote unquote pinheads from sort of freak shows and that, where they'd have a small skull, that they thought that was very African, because they were they seemed almost like they were gonna revert back to being like monkeys, and because monkeys are African. So it's a really awful practice, obviously, but that's sort of what we're dealing with when we're starting to think about disability and quantification in the 19th century. And this led to some very awful things later on with sort of Francis Galton and the birth of eugenics, which feeds into things like, I mean, Alina will know a lot more about this than me, but sort of Nazi ideologies and stuff about disability, sterilization discourses, and stuff. So I mean, it's pretty awful when you start really delving into the histories of these things.
Stuttering and lisping, would that be classified as a disability?
Yes and no. So I've been looking at, quite a long time ago now, but I'm going to return to it. So stuttering is interesting because it's a condition that, the 2010 Equality Act defines a disability as being anything that interferes with your day-to-day life. So if stuttering manifests in speech, then it does qualify as a disability. because it affects your ability to speak, which we consider to be part of everyday life. In the Victorian period, people were less kind about stuttering. It was often seen as a failure, particularly of manliness, because if you're struggling to get your words out, there's something about like not being overly virile, like something about sort of there's a lot of discourses that cross over with sort of premature ejaculation and stuttering, and sort of there's stuff like that they were thinking about, which is really not PC, but that notion,
like this notion that at the time that oratory and the ability to speak in public is seen as like the mark of a great intellectual and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I've done loads of research on this for Arthur Rhys Davids, who's a pilot in the First World War and who had a stutter at Eton whilst being the smartest boy in the school. So it was like, how do you quantify this poor kid that just can't speak when he gets nervous? They treat it like basically I've got all the letters from the doctors and all of the treatment plans and everything, and what it was recitation that they tried to teach him by training him to speak better, like it was something that could be overcome if he practiced talking enough.
Yeah. And the treatment would be to regard people as stupid. So there's a sort of semi-fictional story by James Malcolm Rymer called The Unspeakable, about basically it's a biography about someone with a stutter, and at school they get torn into and treated awfully because they really, really struggle. But he overcomes the stutter by working with someone. But something that was really awful was that to treat stutters initially, it wasn't talking therapy, which early 20th century that you're talking about, but it was doctors in the 1840s and 50s used to think, oh, well, you're struggling to speak, so you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to remove your uvula, which is the dangly bit at the back of your throat, and just parts of your soft palate surgically, and that'll fix you. Which obviously it did not. That is a correct use of the word, obviously, because you just lop out bits of people's mouths. It's not going to help them speak.
Isn't there shock therapy as well? When electricity comes in, and this is a correct use of the word idiots. The idiots think that just shocking everybody is a catch-all for everything as well.
Yeah, or just shove an ice pick in their eyes. It's fine. That was a lot later, but it's that thing where you're like, oh, this is really awful, because I actually, this is totally not my research area, but I read something recently about frontal lobotomies, and the transorbital lobotomy, so putting the ice pick through the eye, was really heralded as being genius because it was going through the eye. What they would do is they would use electroshock therapy in order so that they didn't need anesthetic, because they'd passed out from the electroshock therapy, and they didn't need a surgeon to administer it because they weren't cutting into anything. So really, it's a time saver, because you didn't need all this stuff. You didn't need an anaesthetist. You didn't need a surgeon. You could just do this in your mental institution. Because you could, like, just with a little bit of training. So it was kind of first really almost marketed as revolutionary, because you didn't need expertise to shove something in someone's eye. Whereas, you'd need, if you did want to perform brain surgery, obviously you need surgeons, anaesthetists, etc. But there's just that proposition of, oh, it's great, it's a time saver. It's not as messy. It's just, when you think about it now, you're just like, oh,
what was going through their minds?
Yeah, but it's just the absolute pride of, wow, this is so innovative. We're changing so much. It's so amazing. You're just like, wow. But I mean,
it's like that true Victorian backslapping, isn't it?
Oh yeah, I mean, this is later. This is 20th century, when they were doing the transorbital eye picks and all that. But like, it's just that thing. It's like, but then I can't help think. I almost did like a Sex and the City, but I can't help but wonder. But I can't help but think maybe there's medical things that we do all the time now that in 50 years' time people are going to be like, what the fuck? That, like, even stupid things, like obviously we discovered recently that we didn't need to be taking a week's break when if you're on the pill, in order to have a withdrawal bleed. That was something that the company kind of marketed to the Catholic Church, because they thought if you're interfering with a woman's menstrual cycle, that, you know, they need to bleed at some point in the month. But actually, all these women that have been having unnecessary periods because they were on the pill, they could have just been taking the pill all through the month. There was no evidence. They just wanted to sell it as more natural to the Catholic Church in the 1960s, which is just awful when you think about, like, some women that have terrible times with their menstrual cycles, and they could have just not been having them.
Not have had to have them at all.
Yeah. Same with, I mean, we've been talking about period poverty quite a lot, as in Scotland. We've now got sanitary products available for free by law in public places. But, you know, the amount of women that were having periods that didn't need to, the amount of potential accidental pregnancies or abortions that could have been avoided if women were just taking the pill all the time instead of having that week and then messing up their medication. But it's, you know, that's a small and less terrifying example than lobotomies, for example. But I'm sure there's probably things that we're doing, medically speaking, that in 50 years' time people are going to be absolutely horrified by. I try not to think about that too much when I go to the doctors, because I'm a massive hypochondriac anyway. So the thought that, you know, I could not only be ill, but there's something that I was treating that illness with was going to make me worse, then I would just freak out. But of course, we're in COVID times, and I am sure that this is not going to be a problem with the vaccine. The vaccine is good. Make sure you have the vaccine.
I know. I was sitting there last night thinking, what if it turns out that it's made, like, everyone infertile?
I mean, it'll save the planet.
Yeah. And kill the human race. Anyway, I know we can't, like, I have to be really careful with this as well, because I'm writing about a member of the royal family who I know had an eating disorder. No, it's not Princess Diana. Everybody knows she had an eating disorder. But like you say, it's diagnosing people who aren't around to be diagnosed. And also when you're not a medical professional as well, it's not advisable. But can we look at some historical figures and say, we're pretty sure that if he'd have been diagnosed today, that's a likely diagnosis?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because I think sometimes, particularly with things like dyslexia, that you have to kind of ask the question, who is this diagnosis for? It's not for the person that's dead. It's, you know, it's for people that maybe have learning difficulties now and want something to look up to, which seems like a great thing off the bat, but I find it quite problematic because, I mean, problematic is the classic academic word, isn't it? For when you can't be bothered to engage with it, but you know it's wrong. So I find it quite problematic because the thing is that if we remember disabled people who have managed to do what we consider to be amazing things, and we use this whole discourse of in spite of their disability, is something in disability studies that we call the super crip. So the super disabled person, the absolute superhuman, you know, thinking about people like Stephen Hawking, people like Helen Keller, which actually is really interesting because there's this huge controversy on TikTok at the moment where, like, Gen Z don't believe Helen Keller was a thing. They think she was faking it. There's this whole TikTok trend with millions of Gen Zers being like, nah, didn't happen, fake news about Helen Keller, which is just absolutely obscene to me. But it's worth looking into because it is a rabbit hole, because they just don't believe that someone who is deaf and blind could read and write and be a massive socialist that was watched by the US because she was quite radical in her thinking as well. They just don't think that she would have been able to achieve what she did. But we think about these figures and that puts a lot of pressure. What about the normal disabled people, the people with dyslexia who maybe don't end up being Da Vinci's one of the people that gets a lot of, oh, he's definitely dyslexic because he wrote backwards and all this stuff, just his way of thinking, blah blah blah. What if you're not Leonardo da Vinci like, which most people aren't. It's a difficult issue to sort of hold up and be like, oh, but Einstein was dyslexic. But yeah, I'm not Einstein, and I'm never going to be Einstein. So is that giving me any comfort, or is that giving me some pressure? So it's difficult. I mean, there's several figures in the Victorian period that get was she dyslexic? So Elizabeth Fry was one of them, who was a massive social reformer. Yeats gets it, actually, W.B. Yeats, who he's a little bit later, the poet. There's a few folk that get that sort of, ooh, were they, weren't they? But I think it's quite problematic to try and diagnose. Similarly, I mean, there's a lot of theories about Emily Bronte being autistic or having an eating disorder, and various things going on there. But I think, that's difficult, because are you trying to take away her genius? Because there's this notion about autistic people and savantism, they're being like super, super intelligent. Are you saying that Wuthering Heights and all the amazing things that Emily Bronte and her sisters achieved were just the result of having a neurological difference? Because that's kind of, in a way, minimizing it, but kind of in another way feeding into this like super crip idea, which is quite dangerous, I think. And also, we don't know. We can't assume. So I think it's interesting to have opinions and to think, oh, maybe. But I think going any further than, oh, maybe,
actually sitting there and making a list is beyond.
Yeah, there's a weird. I'm just not. There's a discomfort that's there. It's yeah, as I say, problematic. The absolute academic catch-all. Yeah, that there's more politics involved there than might seem. But equally, I'm not going to take it away from someone who is maybe like a child who's maybe feeling down about struggling with reading and writing, and a parent turning around and being like, oh, well, Einstein was just like I'm not going to take that away from, someone that might get comfort in that, because that's a good thing. But yeah, it's, as I say, problematic.
Yeah, approach with caution.
Yeah.
Louise, thank you so much for joining us. That really hit me home, obviously with the dyslexia and then the dyspraxic stuff. It's been so interesting having you on. Thank you so much.
No worries. I hope I get another stellar review. I think I scored less though, so that's a good thing.
Yeah, well, judging by what he wrote, he won't be listening anyway, so you can say what you like about him.
I don't know.
Thank you so much.
No worries.
Join us tomorrow for hedge hopping with Matt Bone in the morning, and then in the afternoon, Alina's dreams came true because Rana Mitter sat down to talk all about 20th century China, so don't miss out on that one.
Don't forget that we do exist on Patreon as History Hack, and on Patreon as well, which is Podbean's own version. Alina and I have had massive fun doing this in 2020, but life's going to change quite a lot next year, and we're going to actually have to go and earn a living, etc. If we want to keep up the regularity that we've been bringing you, and the kind of guests that we've been bringing you, and the workload, then we will need your help. So if you join, there's going to be incentives for joining on either of those platforms. We're revamping ourselves on both of them, so don't forget to go in. You can do as little as $1 a month, and it all goes towards keeping up History Hack as regular as we've been able to bring it to you this year. We are now on YouTube. We are posting all of our new episodes on there, and we have our own channel, and we are gradually posting all of the back episodes because we have been made aware of the fact that you can only find the last 100 on some platforms. So you can go and listen to your heart's content and laugh at the cartoons and have a great time. So do go over there and subscribe.